Snow fell the way ash might fall after a great fire. Slowly, softly, blanketing nail and stone and the darker scars of old war with a thin, white silence. The forge yard at Winterfell did not belong to silence. Not anymore. Hammers rang from dawn into the blue-black hours when the ravens slept and the wolves' breath smoke-hazed between the kennels. Firelight crawled on the ironwood branches and the lichened walls old as the songs no one sang. The snow still came, but Jon had sworn that the sound of making would come with it, and the sound of keeping, and the sound of saying we will not go gently into the dark. He stood under the covered walk, the wet fur of his cloak heavy with melt. Ghost pressed against his knee, pale as the ground and twice as quiet. In the center of the yard, men and girls, boys and women, bent to anvils and knappers' benches, to drums of pitch and baskets of antler billets. Sparks flared. The raw stink of horn and the sweet, resin-thick scent of melting pine pitch made the cold air taste like sap on the tongue. There were blacksmiths here, iron and steel men from White Harbor and Barrowton and Torrens Square, but the truer work of the hour happened in hands that had learned stone. A then from the free folk held a flake of obsidian up to the light and, with 3 careful strokes of antler on its edge, birthed the triangular glimmer of a knife. A girl from Molestown smirked and copied his pressure and angle and cadence, then laughed as her own shard split, glass clean and feathered. "Better?" Gendry said, and there was praise in the word, though his voice carried the low, iron weight that all these people had slowly learned to copy. He moved through them with a smith's easy grace, hair damp with snow, sleeves rolled back, the muscles of his forearms sooty and shining. Gendry did not reach often for the black glass. He kept to the forge where the arming loops were hammered, the sockets and collars and tangs and ferrules. The iron that would cradle the glass and take a spear's throw and not let the brittle edge shatter when it struck something colder than winter. "No, not too deep," he told a boy whose fingers dug into the antler billet with the impatience of someone who wanted a spear faster than the glass wanted to be. "Glass sings when it's right. Learn that song." Jon watched the boy nod and listened for the song. It came in little breaths of sound, not so much a note as a hush, the whisper of fracture curling through the glass and settling into a new edge. It was like hearing the heart of a beast that had slept for a very long time and now woke slowly, a heartbeat at the edge of hearing that would keep a man alive or put him in his grave. Sansa came to him along the walk, her steps sure and light. Snow dusted the fur that lined her hood. Snow clung to her lashes and did not melt. She looked across the yard with that calm he had learned to read as both care and tally. "You should be in the crypts," she said without reproach, "or asleep in your chair with a blanket over you. At least pretend to be a lord in winter. I have never been good at pretending to be what I'm not." He swallowed a breath that hurt, the cold stabbing down deeper than steel. "The ravens. From Castle Black?" Sansa shook her head. "From Eastwatch by the sea. Tormund's seal. And Ed, the night seas are choked with pack ice. It's slower to send birds when the air is heavy, Maester Wolkan says. But they sent 3. She offered him the folded scrap of oilskin. "He writes like a man trying not to frighten us." Jon took it, and Ghost's ears angled toward the paper as if it might growl. Tormund's blunt scrawl was as he remembered it, fewer words than a giant might use to describe a sunrise. The dead were moving. They did not march like men or like wolves or like anything that listened to wind. They moved where the cold was deepest. They moved with the stillness of the sea before a storm. There had been scouts. There were no scouts now. The great white silence walked. He felt Sansa watching him read the letter that said what they had always known would come. He felt the weight of the words he could not keep from her. "We don't have enough," he said, not yet lifting his eyes from the oilskin. "We won't have enough even if we had everything," Sansa said. "That is not a reason to have less." He looked across the yard again. The glass singing under antler, the iron socket blooming on the end of a spear shaft, the girl laughing at her own skill. The firelight cast Gendry in bronze and shadow. The smith squinted down the shaft of a scorpion bolt and thumbed the collar where black glass would press into iron. Arya was near him, of course she was, hair unbraided and a smile that bared teeth. She had a two-ended spear with a socket that folded. She was showing him where she wanted the weight, and Gendry was shaking his head, and she was shaking hers back, and Sansa sighed and made a little sound that was like laughter but deeper in her throat. "If the Night King comes tomorrow," Jon said, "this yard will still be singing. That is what we can do." "That," Sansa agreed, and touched his arm, and left him with the letter and the sound of making. Davos Seaworth found him before the snow thickened to blind. The Onion Knight had a gift for arriving where he needed to be, as if he carried a map only sensible to those who had sailed hard coasts. He came from the Godswood, breath frosted in a beard gone almost white, hands tucked into the sleeves of a salt-stained cloak so he did not offend the cold by pretending it didn't bite him. "My lord," he said, because he always added the title when he meant to argue. "There's a ship in the harbor you ought to see." "There are ships from White Harbor in White Harbor," Jon said. "Is there another now?" "Aye, one with a belly full of rock. The right rock, and a captain who likes gold more than safe weather." Davos's eyes creased with humor that made him look younger without making him look less tired. "I'll say it plain. Lord Manderley's boys are carrying dragonglass out of Dragonstone faster than their grandfathers carried sardines out of White Harbor, and a few of my friends, let us call them friends, are carrying it faster still. It helps to know which reefs don't shift and which harbor masters do." "And you thought I should meet this captain?" Jon asked. "I thought you should see how much glass 4 men can move in storm season when they believe they'll be paid." Davos coughed, then glanced to the forge yard and the girl with the folding spear. "And I thought you'd ask Gendry how many sockets he can make in a day if he doesn't sleep." "He already doesn't," Jon said. Davos said softly. "That's the other thing. A man can't hammer forever without breaking in a way no socket fixes." He rocked on his heels, then shrugged like a man who knows that the sea isn't interested in his opinion. "But come, see the rock." Winterfell's walls took the wind, but once they crossed the inner gate and came down past the market stalls to the road south, the snow clawed at their faces like an enemy learned patience. "We thought the sea was going to swallow us twice, and we thought we were going to break on drift ice once, but we have all our fingers and toes in our cargo. Where do you want your stones?" Davos answered for him. "Everywhere," he said dryly, "but some places first." They led the captain to the covered walk and a room just off the yard where Gendry and 3 Manderley smiths kept slates and a ledger of charcoal and iron bar, of melted pitch and antler billets and thin leather thongs for binding javelin heads inside their collars. Sansa joined them. Of course she did. She did not require summoning, and leaned over the ledger the way she'd leaned over maps once, tracing supply lines with a finger that remembered when and where. "We'll need a forge at Last Hearth and at Carhold," she said, "and at White Harbor, and smaller ovens and knappers' benches in all the little holdfasts that look at those places for debt and safety. The Umbers will not like that the first of our glass goes to Deepwood Motte instead of up the King's Road to them. But Glover has no love left for the Boltons' old friends. With the Glover men equipped, the coast holds. Then the lakes. Then the Wolf's Wood. Then all of us." "All of us," Jon echoed. He leaned a hand on the table to feel the scrape of wood against his palm. "And how many of the small places will you send a napper to?" "As many as we can, so as many as we should," Sansa said. "We'll send Gendry where it matters to build the ovens that build the sockets that hold the glass. But the glass itself doesn't want fire. It wants hands and patience and time. That we can teach. Arya is better with a blade than she will admit, and she is just proud enough to enjoy telling other people how to do what they think they already know." A flash of a smile. "Lyanna Mormont will learn it with the speed of a bear falling on a trout. Maester Wolkan can write instructions for a child to follow." She glanced at Davos. "You have your smugglers' friends. How many trips can they make across the winter sea before the ice closes Dragonstone?" "As many as gold buys, which is almost as many as they can live through." Davos tugged thoughtfully at the edge of his cloak. "If a man knows the trick of reading a leaden wave for the bone beneath, he can slip drift ice the way a hound slips between trees, but a north wind has opinions. We should take what we can when the wind is busy elsewhere. Lord Manderley writes that his men will keep the channel open as long as it can be kept," Sansa said. White Harbor owes us and loves itself and hates to be told either of those things. He will boast and promise in a way that sounds like generosity and computes to trade. We will smile at the boasting and add the numbers twice. You're your mother in... Gendry laughed at the letter and sobered immediately. Tell her this, he murmured to Jon and Arya as the three of them leaned on the table with a scrawled answer. You seat the head with leather and heat the iron only enough to ease. You never let the iron take fire where the glass will touch it. A spike of iron goes through the shaft into the collar just shy of the glass, and the tie is leather. Don't fix the glass like a blade. Fix it like an egg in a nest. Tell her that. Tell her the rest in person. Arya had learned to fold and unfold her spear in the time it took to pour wine. She had learned to read the balance of a thing by rolling it in her palm and feeling how it wanted to fall. She took the quill and added, in a hand less neat than Alice's and more honest, a drawing of collar and spike. And, she wrote, never throw to show off, throw to end. Jon went where men were not making. He rode out with Ghost at his heel and 30 men close behind and 30 more straggling, as men will when the weather threatens to freeze the sweat on them to a skin of ice. He went to Torrens Square where the Tallheart boy had a face too old for him and a mother who stood straighter than sorrow ought to let her stand, and to the Hornwood where 20 men could empty the woods of deer in a day and now counted steps between trees because the dead could hide in trunks like ghosts. He went into the rills and to Barrowton with its barrow mounds rising like sleeping giants under the snow, and Lady Dustin's eye on him like the edge of a knife that remembered the hand of a man she had despised. He went to the Dreadfort where empty banners hung and the stones seemed to hold a stain that cold could not wash, and he looked at that dark place and said, not again, in a voice that had no witness but Ghost. In each of those places he sent a letter before his horse's breath could cool, and a cart full of collar iron and leather thongs and horn, and a napper to catch the first glimmer of glass. In each he walked the yard with a boy or a woman or a man he trusted to see, and he said, when you think you have made enough, make more. And he ate what they had and did not wince at it, and he listened and did not promise what he could not give. At Deepwood Mott Robert Glover watched Gendry show a man with a scarred hand how to seat a blade in a nest of leather and iron. He held the glass as careful as an infant and looked at Jon with the flat disbelief reserved for things too sensible to be true. You intend to put a forge at every holdfast? He said, voice caught between scoff and wonder. In every crooked hall with a leaking roof and a pile of potatoes for a table? A forge that doesn't melt the glass we're supposed to be making into weapons. A place where a man or a girl can heat iron enough to kiss the glass, Jon said. And enough tools to shape that kiss right. A place where the antler sits and the hands learn patience. The glass breaks easy if you make it move faster than it likes. We'll make the iron move first, and the leather. And who will feed these forges? Glover demanded. He gestured toward the yard where charcoal pyramids hid under snow and the ring of the anvil made men smile with a pride older than debt. There's barely enough wood to keep a hall from freezing. You want a forge in every holdfast. You'll strip the rills of their last trees and you'll have men falling asleep standing, because they've been cutting all day and hungry enough to chew their own belts. Jon had thought that through at night in the long hour when the fire settled to coals and the air tried the doors like a polite thief. Peat burns, he said. We've peat enough in the wet places to build kilns to dry it by the thousand. The Manderleys will send coal until the winter bites their ships, and the Riswells owe us more than a nod. They can spare a grove of old spruce, and they will or they will answer for it. The point is not to burn hot. It is to burn consistent until you can bend iron without losing your fingers. We can do that with peat. Peat for the glass, leather for the collars, iron for the sockets, Glover said, counting on his hand like a man listing debts. And people who know the right songs to sing to stone. And who will teach them to sing? Tormund Giantsbane. Tormund was at that moment across the yard, laughing at the snow as it bit his cheeks, eating the heel of a loaf a boy had not wanted. He will if I ask, Jon said, and could not help the small smile. I mean to ask everyone. It moved quickly because there was no time for slow. Winterfell's ravens flew like starlight scattered from the same hand, and wherever they fell, the inked notes said the same thing. We will teach you to build the iron that will hold the glass that will end a dead thing walking. A napper will come. A smith will come. We will send a wagon of antlers and a man who knows how to listen to stone. Build a lean-to. Build a shed. Dig into the side of a hill. A forge is a fire and a roof and a place to set your tools. Do not wait for permission to live. At Carhold, Alice read the note aloud on the steps, breath smoking, hair braided tight, and the men around her, boys too, nodded and went to work as if she had asked them to take down a tent before a storm. They built a shed of planks with a low mouth like a cave and aired it with holes punched high under the eaves. They took their iron to red where the collars would grip and tempered it to straw in the cold air, and Alice, with her careful hands and careful mind, spoke to the glass in a voice no louder than the wind and coaxed it to edges that bit. She fixed the first of the spears with leather and tied the head with knots she'd learned at her brother's elbow, and he had learned from a man who'd sailed to White Harbor once for the sight of the sea. She sent a raven to Winterfell with a word and a smile that turned the ink slightly crooked. Tell Gendry I have found the softness. At last Hearth Ned Umber had no softness in him. His hair had gone white at the tips where wind licked a boy's head raw. His knuckles had more scars than a man twice his years, and when he smiled it looked like he had remembered how but did not trust the memory. He read the letter with his mouth moving and then with his mouth not moving, and he said, "Good," and did not waste time pretending to understand all the bits at once. He set 2 old men to napping with a then who could break a flake the length of a forefinger and leave a thinner edge than a razor. He set boys to gathering antler and set girls to boiling leather. He sent a rider south for iron with a sign cut in bark that would get him through the Serwyn lands without argument. He built a shed. He hung a bell. He told them to ring it if the dead came. "We'll ring it if a deer comes," one of the old men said, and Ned grinned at him like a boy. "Do that," he said, and he struck the iron with glass and watched the way the edge curled a curl of leather as thin as breath. The dead did not wait for them to be ready, but readiness is not a thing you hold in the hand and show to an enemy. It is something you become by degrees. At the lakes around Long Lake the air froze in curtains that the wind lifted and put down, and in those curtains men saw shapes that were not there and shapes that were, and water creaked under 20 men on skates with rope around their waists. They pulled a sledge loaded with spear shafts and antler billets and a crate of collar iron. Behind them came a woman with a napper's kit and a crate of big, flat stones that would become 1,000 knives. When the dead came into the trees they came without sound. The first deer in the river sees its reflection and thinks it sees another deer. The first man walking out onto a black lake sees a reflection and thinks it sees him. These things are small warnings and the living rarely heed them. The white stepped out into a clearing where breath hung like moss. The men flinched. The napper did not. She put a blade in a shaft and handed it to the man closest to her. "When it hits bone, do not twist," she said calmly. "Pull clean." For all the talk of plans and letters, the first of the new spears to kill a dead thing in the open north came like that. Suddenly, under fir trees, with a woman from over the wall handing a dragonglass spearhead to a man whose left boot leaked and whose right hand shook. He thrust, because that is what men do when death comes near. He did not watch the blade burn the thing behind its eyes into wind and frost. He felt the way the spear stopped resisting in his hand as if a tether had been cut somewhere else. The old men at last Hearth did better on the second and the third. On the fourth, Ned Umber himself threw because he had to know the weight of ending. It took him a day and a night to stop looking at his hand afterward, as if it had become a stranger while he wasn't looking. News like that went quickly. Ravens flew. Riders rode. A woman in the rills wrote a letter that said, "It works," as if she had doubted and had been ashamed to doubt. Bows began to string with glass tips. Quivers filled with black feathered bolts that gaped like mouthfuls of night. Men who had never thought to see war stood in their yards with knives they had made and felt the strange peace that comes when you hold in your hands a thing that will make a difference. Women who had thought to keep only hearth and child watched the iron's heat and bent over them, and the music of the yard. The antler's kiss on glass, the iron's breath, the wife's voice to her husband to mind his fingers, wove into the winter itself. Arya rode to Carhold with Gendry and 12 boys. 3 of them older than her and 4 of them more afraid. She wanted to see if the drawing she'd made on the ledger had helped. which was one way of saying she wanted to see Alice Karstark's face when she put a spear into the eye of a dead man and watched him fall like a struck icicle. She did not say that part. She sat her horse like a squirrel, comfortable and watchful and ardent. The little mare the stablemaster had insisted she take because Winterfell had not spent years keeping bloodlines to see them frozen to death in stalls. Twitched her ears at the wind like it was a personal adversary. Gendry rode a big-boned gelding that could pull a wagon if asked, a hammer on his back and a satchel with iron collars bumping his thigh. He smiled at Arya in the moments when the road went half kind and the wind forgot to fight. "You drew a good collar," he said, gesturing at a blank patch of air as if the drawing drifted there still. "You always did." "I drew monsters on the back of the butcher's ledger once," Arya answered, mouth twisting. "They weren't as useful. Where did you learn to fix the nest without splitting the glass?" "In a place that burned hot enough to teach me that everything breaks if you make it do what it doesn't want," he said lightly. "I've been watching the Vens. You have to pretend the glass is already the shape it is going to be, even before it is. You have to flatter it." "You're ridiculous," she said, and he grinned wider and sped his gelding just enough to make Ardent prick her ears and go. Carhold was bare and stern and full of men who nodded when you spoke and did not waste you on yes. Alice met them in the yard with a face that let them know it had been a hard month and a good one. "The collars don't crack now," she told Gendry after the first hello. "We found the softness." She clapped Arya's forearm in a grip that said, "I remember knives." 2. In the lean-to forge, the collars shone like dull gold where firelight spun. Arya stood with 4 boys and a woman whose jaw had a scar where a blade had kissed it badly, and she showed them how the spear's balance changes when you can fold it and when you can shove the head in a man's guts and forget how polite the word gut sounds in a hall. She folded her spear into a staff and spun it, then unfolded it into a twin-pointed thing and caught a fleece thrown high and pinned it against a post. Alice threw one of the new spears at the target pinned behind the fleece, and the glass head bit clean and stuck. "We will need more of those," she said. "We're making them in our sleep," Gendry answered, then rubbed his eyes. "Or something like." On the way back they found 3 dead things in the trees and a white walker coming as if to see whether the rumors of black glass were true. He was tall without being taller than men, and the air dulled around him, and the snow under his feet made a sound so soft it sounded like apology. His armor had the faint, pale gleam of lake ice. His eyes were the blue of a winter sky on a day the wind wouldn't let you breathe. Arya saw him first, which meant that the others had enough time to see him before he reached them. It also meant the others had enough time to be afraid. She was not. It was not pride. It was something else that had taken pride's seat and folded its hands. There is a place in the mind, she had learned, where no one else sits, and that place had room in it now for only breath and step and the weight in her hands. Gendry's hammer touched her knee without looking like it had. He had the other end of her spear in his hand, and she felt the press of his fingers against the wood and then the way that weight left as he let her have it. She had not learned to throw to show off at Winterfell because she had learned that before, and she did not throw now. The walker saw her. She saw him back. She ran toward the tree to her left and then toward the one behind, and then, because motion in a place full of motion is its own kind of camouflage, she ran toward him with the spear balanced like a brush across her palms. There is a moment between 2 footfalls when a body is a lit fuse. That was when she threw. If it had been a man, the head would have struck the place where his throat met his chest, and there would have been no more words. It was not a man. It moved at the last way a branch does when a heavy wind finds it. The spearhead sang in that hush way glass sings, kissed the thing's ribs instead of the throat, and slid with a sound that was the opposite of steel. The walker looked down at the place where smoke rose from him like mist, and Arya ran to pick up the spear before he could think of picking it up for her. Gendry drove his hammer at the thing's sword. The hammer and the pale blade met with a sound like a bell dying. He did not try that again. He picked up a dragonglass dagger and came at the thing's left, and it turned as if bored and backhanded him with that broad, pale blade. The blow cut his shoulder and the cold went into him where the iron had cut. He stumbled. Arya slid to him and hunkered down, body between him and the thing, and the walker came on. Later, if she had wanted to, which she did not, She could have told the story as if it were all grace. There is no grace in killing a thing made of cold. There is only decision. She had two spearheads. She had a man who would die if she did not decide. She flicked the spear closed and it became a staff, and she put it under the thing's arm where the ribs lift when you move, and then she twisted and let the spear open, and the head, in opening, bit. She did not twist to show off. She twisted to end. The walker stopped being. It didn't fall. It unmade, and the air unburdened itself with a low relief. The three dead things in the trees became piles of meat that the cold could not preserve in a way that mattered anymore. Arya took a breath that was too much like a sob. Gendry found her arm and found the spear, and then laughed once and then didn't, his face suddenly ashen with the pain in his shoulder. They rode home slower. At Winterfell, Sansa listened to the tale and did not gasp. She put a hand on Arya's hair, which Arya tolerated with the vast patience reserved for blood, and then put her hand on Gendry's uninjured shoulder and pressed it exactly once. "You will not hammer tomorrow," she said. "If I don't, who will?" he protested. "I will," said a man at the back with a voice that was half North and half something else. It was Theon, who had returned to the yard with a face calmer every day. He stood in a place that did not smell of iron and fear. He held up his hands with their absence making itself plain. "I can't shape a collar the way you do, but I can shape a nail well enough. And there's 100 nails in everything we're trying to make, and most of them are out of sight and critical. And here I thought you'd had your fill of iron," Arya murmured. "So did I," Theon said, and the two of them shared a look that was not cordial and not cold. Jon watched all of it and went back to the ledger and the map, where Sansa was arranging pebbles. She used stones from the yard rather than painted tokens. It seemed to suit the time. Black stones for forges, white for holdfasts that had sent back a bell, blue for rivers. She had a heap of red stones she was not placing. "Those?" he asked. "Signal fires," she answered. "The sort that let a man at Carhold tell a man at Last Hearth that the dead are within an hour's walk. This is a cold that eats sound. We have to send it another thing to chew. Smoke will do. There are valleys where the wind goes in straight lines. We'll use them." She slid a black stone toward Bear Island and frowned. "If Lyanna burns all the pitch in 1 week, I will skin her alive." "She will skin herself before you can do it," Jon said, and let himself smile. Then the smile went away. "Tormund's letter says the dead have taken Hardhome. If they have men there to make more of themselves, then fast or slow is not our choice anymore. It is theirs." Sansa's hand hovered over the red stones and then fell on one. She placed it at the gift, near a village that had been abandoned in Jon's father's time, then one at Queen's Crown, and one at a ruined tower farther west. "A net, he said softly. "A net of stone and fire and glass. If we can slow them, that will be worth more than stopping them. Slowing is a kind of stopping that leaves people alive." Jon closed his eyes and saw a net. He saw how it might break, and how a break would be terrible, and how that was no reason not to weave it. They began to call the sheds forges, in the way people call a thing what it is most used for. You could make a hinge or a nail or a spoon in one, and bread rose nearby because heat is promiscuous, but what the sheds made most of all were the rings and sockets that would hold black glass. Boys learned to flake with a delicacy that surprised their mothers. Girls learned to tap a collar into true with a touch that surprised themselves. Free folk nappers from the haunted forest took to teaching with a pride they wore like a tattoo. A man from Skagos with a voice like gravel and a coat made from the skin of a seal taught out beyond Long Lake and would sometimes begin to sing a low song to the glass before he struck it. The notes were nonsense. The effect was not. Men stopped watching the snow so much. They watched their hands and the quiet songs. There were accidents. Glass cuts differently than steel, and one boy lost 2 fingers to a blade he had made too honest. And a woman trying to seat ahead let herself be persuaded by haste and heat at once and burned the glass into white. The collar shattered when it cooled. She stared at the pieces as if surprise alone might assemble them. Gendry took off his apron and stood beside her. "You loved it too hard," he said gently. "We all do that with something. You'll love it right tomorrow." The forges pulled people in winter the way wells pull people in summer. An old man at Barrowton, who had owned a hammer and a hand axe and nothing else one could call tools, came every day after that, to watch if he couldn't do, and to teach if he couldn't watch. His voice had gravel and sunlight in it. "The trick," he said to anyone who would listen, "is to treat it like a deer that's come in close. You can have it, but you have to pretend you don't want it. Let it think it's got you fooled." He died in his sleep, and the yard fell silent the next morning without anyone telling it to. The girl he had taught 2 days before sat on his stool and cried without noise. Then she took up his billet and went back to work. White Harbor became a throat for the North to breathe through. The harbor froze and unfroze in long rhythms. The tides bullied what the ice would not give. Lord Wyman Manderley wrote in a fair hand with a fat man's humor, "Your forges drink coal faster than my nephew drinks ale, and they will both be the size of boats if I do not ration them." He appended a list of prices, a list of ships, and a note explaining where a stranded captain could find a cask and an honest ear. He sent a nephew to Winterfell, not the one who drank too much but the one who listened too hard, to stand over a yard with a ledger and a purse and a knife. He sent a cook who could make a pot of fish and onions into a reason to live another day. Davos made houses out of friends. He took fishermen who had thought their boats were winter-broken and convinced them that a winter boat is a thing that floats because someone refuses to accept that it won't. He returned to Winterfell with his cheeks salt-burned and his fingers more scarred than before, and a look in his eyes like a candle that wanted to gutter but refused. "We can keep it open," he said of the sea. "Not clean, not safe, not smooth. Open. Give me 2 more ships and 2 more men who'll turn a blind eye to the bottom of a cask, and I'll get you 2 more loads of glass before the wind changes its mind." 2 more ships, Sansa said, and opened the purse. 3. And a letter for Lord Manderley asking him to forgive himself for wanting to be thanked. "We thank him." She and Jon wrote letters like that, together, a strange mirror of what a boy he had been and a girl she had been might have imagined. He wrote in a hand that had learned to be careful on the wall, and she wrote in a hand her mother had taught her and the world had perfected. To Lady Dustin they wrote, "If you keep your men closer to the barrows you can see farther. Light a fire on the 3rd mound and we will know if the dead come." To Robert Glover they wrote, "The woman from Queen's Crown remembers how iron bends without cracking when you let it pass through red into straw. Seat your collars at straw." To Alice Karstark they wrote, "The first spear you made will kill a king, and the 3rd a thief, and the 10th a friend if you aren't careful. Count." At Castle Black, Ed Tollett counted the days with a bleak humor that seemed almost grateful to have found something that would persist long enough to laugh at. He sent a letter to Jon that said, "The wind came from the wrong side yesterday and the day before. We named it. I am not sure if that helps." Tormund wrote, "We ate a seal. Tasted like a seal. If you have glass to send, send it. I have men who think themselves brave and I would like to see them have wives yet." The wall felt thinner in those letters. Then, in the ravens that came after, the wall felt like a man with a fever who still insisted he could hold a door. It snowed so hard that sound had nowhere to go. A piece of the world broke. They heard of the breaking when a raven came to Eastwatch and not to Castle Black, and when a rider, face cracked by wind, stumbled into Last Hearth with a mouth that could not find words and hands that could not let go of his reins. Viserion had blown blue fire into ice and the wall had fallen at Eastwatch by the sea. Snow does not fall like that in a man's mind. It lances. It screams. Words came as if pulled by a rope, one by one. Dragon, blue wall, gone. Tormund's rough hand on a shoulder. Ed's voice saying something bitter, roof when it starts to rain. The red stones on the map were placed for the breath between 2 heartbeats. The first signal fire went up at Queen's Crown when the wind drove smoke sideways, and a boy on a tower near the Gift saw it through a break in sleet and lit his own. From there it went west to a ruin that had belonged to no lord for 3 generations, and east to a fishing hamlet that had forgotten its name and now remembered responsibility. The line of smoke laid itself like a stitch along the wound the wall's fall had opened, and the dead came. They did not come the way Jon had learned men come to war, with banners and with the slow push of bodies turning fear into courage by force of embarrassment. They came like weather. A farm's door was shut, and then the latch lifted, and what a woman had buried tore its way inside. A bell rang at last hearth, and then rang again, and then Ned Umber rang it himself and told the old men to stop ringing and to go to the yard and hand the spears to the girls, who were better shots, and to take the knives for themselves. He pulled the leather thong that held the dragonglass knife he had made and said to himself, "This is ridiculous," and then stepped into something ridiculous and necessary, like a puddle you step into because the shore has vanished. It was not one battle. It was any number of small ones. Men in cleared fields strangled on their breath in blue wind and tried not to swallow their own tongues and lifted spears because lifting is a habit that sometimes saves you. A woman in the Hornwood took 2 girls by the shoulders and taught them to throw at a body that moved the wrong way in the wrong cold, and then stood behind them to throw the knife herself when her daughter's arms trembled. A boy in the rills learned that a knife does not come back after it has done its work, and that the best way to get it back faster is to put the next knife where it belongs. There were big fights, too, because there are big places, and the Dead Sea open ground and are greedy for it. On the frozen shallows west of Long Lake, 60 men and 30 women and 10 boys and 8 girls stood in a crescent against a wind that made their hair stand up in their hoods and made their teeth ring in their skulls. Gendry had built a scorpion on runners and fitted its jaws with a cradle for a bolt sheathed in glass and iron. He had made the collar with 2 pieces of leather, one softer than the other, and a wedge that stopped the glass from slipping in the moment after impact. He had tied and retied the knot that held the wedge until it had held a dozen times without failing. "It will hold," he told Jon. "I can make it hold." "It will have to," Jon said. He could feel Longclaw in his hand even when he didn't look, which was both comfort and weight. "We have to kill them, not only they're dead. When a walker goes, his pack goes with him. We need to take the head off the line." The first White Walker into that crescent crossed the lake with the casual, arrogant tread of a man who had learned when to fear and when not to, and had learned those lessons hundreds of years ago. The bolt Gendry loosed struck him lower than the throat, but it struck. The glass sang. The iron cradled. The leather held. The walker paused. He put a hand to his chest the way a vain lord does when a seam snags at a feast. Jon saw the smoke rise. He ran. Behind him he felt the change in the dead, but it is a trick of the living mind to think a change in the dead is a thing you can use fast. You can't. You have to end the thing that makes the change. He went at that walker with Longclaw, and the pale sword met the dark one, and the bell of that dying sound knelled in his teeth. The light in the walker's eyes belonged to winter. Jon ducked the blade's return and slid inside it and cut low. He felt something that was not exactly resistance give. He cut again and cut through, and the thing unmade. 3 dozen dead fell, boneless and enormous and harmless as winter-killed branches. The second walker did not join the crescent. He walked to the edge of the fight and watched with the mild interest of a naturalist observing a hive. Arya saw him and did not run toward him. She ran away. He watched her as she went and then looked back at Jon, who was laughing in a way that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with living. Arya took 3 steps on the ice and then 3 steps on snow and then went behind a stunted birch and was gone. He lost her. She came up under him and behind him like a bad idea that had been waiting all your life, and you finally understood the words it wanted to say. The dagger in her left hand went to the seam in his armor. He turned, but he turned into the dragonglass, not away, and the world sighed as the thing left it. They did not win that day. You do not win against a storm. You survive it or you don't. But when they fell back to the next line of their net, with the signal fires flaring smoky in a wind that tasted of old bones, they had broken something in the long blue chain that pulled the dead behind it. Men who had thought themselves brave because they had no choice found themselves braver. Women who had thought themselves weak found that the glass loved their hands. A boy from Torrance Square put a knife in a white rib and later could not stop shaking. But the shaking did not keep him from eating or sleeping, kept him from lying. Sansa sent orders now without looking at Jon because she did not need to. Barrow Tun will send its peat north, she said. To the Serwins and the Umbers. The Risswells will send leather south. The Manderleys will send iron wherever the smoke is thickest. No one counts debt. I will count debt. Later. She had never been a commander. She had never cared to be. It came to her like spinning does to a patient woman. She kept the thread from tangling. She put the right thing in the right place and kept her people from breaking in a way that could. And be mended. In the God's Wood, Bran sat under the heart tree and saw without seeing. The red leaves whispered over his head in a wind that did not rustle the other trees in the same way, and the face cried, as heart trees do. When Jon came to him with the smell of forge smoke and leather and winter in his hair, Bran did not look up. "It is not a net," he said, to a question Jon had not asked aloud. "It is a weaving. Nets catch. Weavings hold." "We're not catching the dead, Bran," Jon said, squatting to make his face level with his brothers. "We are trying to live longer than their patience." "That is catching," Bran said, and his mouth did something like a smile. "You don't need me to tell you where to place your fires. You've already placed them. What you need me to tell you is that there is a thin place near Last Hearth where men cut peat centuries ago and never went back. If you take your best fighters there, you can stand on ground that remembers living. But if you stand there, you will not be elsewhere." "That is the shape of it," Jon said. "Being where you are means not being where you are not." Bran's face cleared. "Arya will be where she is not," he said, and then blinked, and his gaze returned to the present like a bird returning to a branch. "She usually is." Jon snorted and stood, and Bran added softly, "There is a cold behind their cold. There is a name behind their namelessness. I can't look at it and keep all of myself. Don't ask me to." "I won't," Jon said, and meant it. "Stay. See enough to keep us from walking off a cliff. No more." He put a hand on the heart tree's bark and then drew it back quickly. It was warmer than the air. "Ghost likes the birches best," Bran murmured, and the dire wolf lifted his head and tilted it, as if to say that this was old news. They lost the last hearth. Ned rang the bell until the rope pulled blood down his hands and then did not ring it again. He left the bell swinging and took his best 20 and led the others out through a drift trench he had dug the day before because he had taken to imagining the yard filled with blue and asked himself how he would leave it if it were. The dead came over the east wall not because they had found a way but because the wall had exhausted its ways to say no. Ned set a spear in a walker and laughed, not because anything was funny but because he could not believe that anything in the world could ever end, and then watched it end. He retreated with a dozen, then 8, then 6, and when the last 3 boys looked at him their faces were so white they looked already dead. But they were not, because death is not white, and he told them to keep walking south no matter what they heard behind them. They did. He turned and threw the last of his knives because the last of his knives is what his hand found. When the dead picked over the last hearth an hour later, they did not find him. He was standing in a ditch with his hand over his mouth, remembering the sound of the bell. He walked south. He found a fire. He slept 20 heartbeats at a time, like a man hurting himself in small increments because he knows that if the pain is too big it will take him. He arrived at Carhold with the laugh still stuck in his throat. Alice Karstark took one look at him and took the laugh away with something as simple as the touch of her palm to his cheek. She put a bowl in his hand and made him drink and did not tell him to tell her, but he did. She listened. When he was done, she said, "We will not rebuild it yet. We will not give the dead a place to break. We will make knives until the knives become us. Then we will go." In White Harbor, a crewman with hands cracked by salt and cold came too fast up the gangplank of the Laughing Net and shouted something about ice. Davos snapped, "Ice is the water we sail on," and then stopped when he saw the man's face. The sea had closed like a fist. The Laughing Net could not leave, and the boats that tried were trapped against a shifting skin that groaned like a wounded bull. He sent a raven to Winterfell that said, "The sea is done with us for now. We have coal and food stored. We'll send it inland by sleigh." There was a postscript, small and tidy despite the scrawl. "Tell Gendry there's a blacksmith here who shows promise. He will make collars until he drops, and then he will sleep and make more." The long, slow falling back felt less like retreat than like breathing. That was Sansa's word for it, and it stuck. You cannot retreat if you still breathe. The signal fires stitched and restitched. The forges beat, steady, unglamorous, relentless. A boy in the Barrowlands learned to strike the collar only twice, not 3 times, because 3 was the rhythm of haste. A widow in the rills found that her hands, which had known flax since she was 6, knew glass like a cousin. She made 100 knife heads in 2 days and then slept like the dead without meaning to, woke and made 100 more. Ghost's nose bled once after a sprint. Jon wiped the blood away and told the wolf, "Don't be noble," and Ghost sneezed in his face. They kept the dead from White Harbor for a time by dropping half a hillside by torching the north face of a peat bank that had been cut 2 deep years back. It went with a soft sigh like a tired beast, and the mud and snow and peat fell into a gorge the dead had been trying to use. The smell of the burn reached Winterfell a day later, faint as a memory, and Jon tasted it and closed his eyes. "They'll come around," he said to Sansa. "They always come around a thing they can't go through. We've bought a week. Then we will spend the week foolishly," Sansa replied. "Make a list of all the sensible things and do none of them. Do all the things that will feel like living. You're a strange commander," he told her, almost smiling. "I'm commanding people," she said, "not spears." They took that week and knit it into the fabric of a world where weeks had become fiction. Arya sparred with Brienne until both were bruised and both grinning and both unable to explain to anyone watching why joy had crept in. The joy of being exactly where you should be with someone who can meet you there. Theon stood with Sansa on the battlements and watched the sky lighten and then dim without ever truly daying. "I can help at the forges," he offered. "You already are," she said simply, and he flinched and then held still and then let the words sit. Davos told a story about a storm in which the sky had gone green and a man had sung to the waves as if they were girls and the waves had not minded. He told it to a room full of boys and girls who did not know that they were boys and girls anymore. He said the end out loud and they heard that it was not a joke and did not laugh. Gendry slept 20 heartbeats and then 20 more and then a full hour. When he woke, he put leather and iron and glass together in a way that had the right feel and then made 5 more of that one because that's how you know if a thing is real. A raven came down out of the south, wild-eyed and thin as a bone needle. When they took the tube from its leg, there was a scrap of a note, a few words scrawled as if the hand writing them had been trying to outrun something. "She is coming," it said. Then, with the glass, and under that, a slash like a sigh, and the signature, if it was such, was a long looping D. Jon stood very still with that letter in his hand, and Sansa watched him, and he said nothing for a long time. When he did speak, it was to the air between them, as if naming a wind. "Daenerys," he said, "with ships that carry rock. Her dragons will eat too much," Sansa said without heat. "But their shadows might be worth it." Arya looked at the letter, then at Jon, then at the north and all its ugly beauties. "If she comes," she said, "keep her away from the forges, because fire and glass," Gendry began mildly. "Because she is a person who needs to be kept away from the things we are making that matter," Arya said. "People like that don't know what to do with a tool that isn't theirs." Jon said nothing. The letter burned in his hand, though the ink was cold. Daenerys came with fewer men than the word queen suggests and more need than the word grace forgives. The dragons were distant on the first day, shadows that made the goats in the outfield yards try their ropes and the dogs throw their voices at the sky. On the second day, one of the beasts came low enough that you could see the ripple of muscle moving like the sea under scale. Sansa stood with her hands folded and her face interested and not impressed. Jon stood with his hand on Ghost and remembered the way shadow had laid itself over a parched battlefield in the south, as if to promise rain. Daenerys came to the yard with her hair like bright ash and her coat like a promise kept too long. She looked at the glass the way a woman looks at the man she had not wanted to marry but has found she cannot live without. She touched nothing. "I brought what I could," she said to Jon, the words ironed flat. "The caves at Dragonstone can make a smith forget his age. We are late." "I am sorry." "You are not late," Jon said, "because there is no timeline where the dead apologize. You are here." She looked at Sansa. Sansa looked at her. If the air had been warmer, it might have caught fire. As it was, the cold kept their dislike from rising to extravagance. "Lady Stark," Daenerys said. "Your Grace," Sansa answered. They did the careful dance of people whose wants might break the floor if set hard enough, and then they did the practical work of moving rock. The ships brought glass and coal. The dragons brought fear and a kind of morale that was not quite fear's opposite. People stepped lightly when a dragon might be overhead. They worked in the hours when a shadow was a blessing. Gendry placed Daenerys at a table with 2 collars and a strip of leather and watched her fingers when she tried to seat them. Her hands were fine and strong with no memory of iron in them. She laughed when the collar slipped and the glass clinked to the floor, and for an hour after that he could like her without effort. She walked the yard with Jon and watched the nappers from the Free Folk and the girl from Molestown and Alice Karstark and the Manderley Smith whose hands were big as hams and the boy with only 9 fingers. She watched them all work with their heads down and their jaws set and their breath smoking. "You have made a kingdom of forges," she said softly. "I cannot think of a better sort." "If we win," Jon said, "we will go back to being stubborn about less beautiful things." "And if you lose," she said. "If we lose, there will be no forges," he said. When the dead moved toward Winterfell, toward everything Winterfell stood for and had become, they did not need to be told that this was a place to break. Winterfell had always been a stay against a storm. In this winter it had become the place the whole north had woven itself around. The signal fires brought the word the way a net brings silver bellies in a single heave. The forges did not stop. They worked until the night before the battle and then kept working under canvas in the Godswood with the sound muffled by snow, and then kept working in the corners of the Great Hall while women stirred stew and men took their second laces off their boots so they could sleep an hour with warm feet and still move if they had to. Sansa went among them with blankets and with lists and with a voice that could cut cloth without a knife. "No one dies in a corner because of paper," she told Wolkan, who willingly took the abuse of intelligence. "If a bell rings, you come to where you are needed and bring the paper with you." She parceled grain like a miser and bacon like a saint and set cookpots over every usable heat, so that there would be hot meat and hot broth and hot oat on tongues that needed to learn that the I had begun with something that belonged to the living. She braided hair with hands that had forgotten they knew it. She sharpened no knife, though she knew she could. She let other hands have that job and chose the work that would keep those hands from shaking. Brienne walked with a sword slung low and talked softly to men who needed tallness and to women who needed kindness. She and Jaime Lannister had come to a truce written in old iron and deep breath, and if there had been time, there would have been something else. There was not time, and so there was only the honesty that grows between 2 people who have to decide whether to stand back to back. "We will stand back to back," Brienne told him, and Jaime smiled like a man who has glimpsed a country he will never reach and is not embittered by it. On the morning when the dead came like fog, like memory, like a rumor made flesh, Jon stood in the yard and looked at the forges. There were 9 now, hissing and smoldering, each with a little shrine of black glass and antler and leather nearby like offerings to a god that was real and did not care about offerings. He thought of the first knife cut in Molestown and the first collar that seated without cracking in Carhold. He thought of Ned Umber's hands bleeding on a bell rope, and of the sound the world had made when a walker unmade at Long Lake. He thought of his father sharpening his sword on a day like any other and how that had been, in its way, a prayer. Then he checked the line. The collars were seated. The scorpions had their glass-sheathed bolts in cradles with wedges that would not slip. The pits had been driven with stakes that bore black and shone dull as the inside of a raven's wing. The trenches were oiled and braided with pitch. The Godswood had a path that was not a path. He found Arya and touched her shoulder, and she looked at him and her face was bright and ferocious, and he felt superstitiously that the world had decided not to end today, because she had that look on it. He found Sansa and spoke nothing, and she squeezed his hand and said, "Do not try to carry anything more alone." "I don't," he said. "I can't." "You always can," she said. "Don't." The dead came while the sun was a rumor somewhere else. At first there was only a stillness that was not peace, and then the cold gathered like cloth and began to settle on faces. In that cold you can hear your own blood move. In that cold your breath becomes a separate thing. Then they were there, and the new knives met the old dead, and the world became small and exact. A line of men and women. A line of things that had no lines. Gendry's scorpions sang. The bolts leapt and the glass bit, and where it bit a walker unmade and a dozen fell. The leather held. The collars held. The iron gave nothing to the cold. Arya moved in a shape like smoke, always where a blade wanted to go and never where it could arrive. Brienne held the left flank with a calm that men wove their breath through like a cord. Jaime's sword remembered how to be used for something other than pride. Theon stood in the godswood with men who had cut their arrows to fit ash bows and goosefeather fletching, and each arrowhead had glass in it. And they looked at the leaves and were not afraid, though their bodies remembered the feeling and offered it to them more than once. Daenerys came with fire from above. There is a difference between fire and dragonfire, and there is a difference between living fire and blue. When the dragon's shadow crossed the dead, they did not look up the way men do. They do not look up. The dragon's fire blew a path through the whites and left a trench of ash that men held for a breath and then two. The blue fire came once in a sweeping arc high enough to deny and broad enough to be a prophecy. The oil in the trenches caught and guttered and roared. The wind tried to take the flames and could not decide whether it could. Jon found a walker and found that he loved killing it in a way that shook him. This is the part of the story that men in halls soften with self-congratulation. He did not soften it to himself. He saw the thing that made other things break, and he broke it because he could and because he had thought so much about breaking it that the thought had become a thirst. Theon fell to his knees, not because his body had to but because his body was honest. "You're a good man," Bran said to him, not as a benediction but as a piece of information that might help something fit in its place. Theon nodded. "Dead once and let it fit, and when the Night King reached him, he rose because you meet a thing on your feet, and then the world did not have him anymore. A knife flew and missed. It is important to remember that. Arya is not a god. A knife flew and missed because the thing she had aimed at was not shouting, 'Come here,' as a man's throat does. She was in a tree and then on a stone and then behind another tree. The Night King stepped toward Bran the way a man steps toward a door that has been his since childhood. He moved like a song a child learns without knowing he is learning it. Arya moved in the place between heartbeats. When she came down, she was not a hawk. Hawks are too loud. She was the absence of a hawk, and that is quieter. The dagger in her hand was not glass. It was older than that idea. It had liked killing before and liked it now. The Night King's hand found her throat. The other found her wrist. She dropped the dagger the way a girl drops a stitch when she is thinking of something else. It fell and then it was in her other hand because hands learn things about each other, and the dagger went where a seam would be if ice had tailors, and the world pushed a breath out of itself so hard that men fell to their knees in yards far from Winterfell and did not know why. The dead fell. They fell on their faces, and they broke like poor pottery, and there were too many of them for dignity. The dragons wheeled and one screamed, and the scream was an end to something that had terrified all of them without their knowing exactly what. The fire went on burning because fire always does after, the way grief does. In the aftermath, there are always lists. Sansa made lists because she had to. She made them with a hand that did not shake and broke into tears only when she was alone under a roof with a hole in it, and the dripping made a kind of irregular drum. The lists had names. Some were going to be buried in ground that had thawed because fire had thawed it. Some were going to be burned because fire had loved them last. The lists had numbers. How many spears left, how many collars, how many knives. They set stones on stones and made their yard a place that grew things that didn't die easily. Ned Umber wrote with a hand that had learned to be blunt. "I'm not rebuilding a hall for dead men to practice taking. I'm building a shed for living to make things in and an oven for bread and a bell." He drew the bell badly. "Hang it inside the forge," Sansa wrote back. "Let it ring whenever a collar seats without cracking." At Carhold, Alice Karstark married a man she liked and had liked before. "You can ask," she said, soft as smoke, "but you can't have me when I want a road. And you can't come with me when I'd be better alone. And you can't stop making things because the quiet you get when you make things is the only quiet you get." "I know," he said. "Ask me again when there's no work," she said. And they both knew what she meant. And he smiled like a man who can bear good news and went back to his collar. Jon walked the yard and the godswood and the wall. He walked the kennels where the dogs slept with a calm like rain. He walked the crypts and spoke to a man who was both father and not, and to a woman who was both mother and rumor, and he was not sure how the dead hear us when we talk to them, but he was sure that the living do, and so he said the things aloud for himself. He said that he had thought himself king for half a breath because men who needed a word said it, And then he had thought himself less than a boy because truth had come with a blade in its hand. And then he had been told that the world would end and had decided to count glass and leather and antlers. He said that counting had saved him from the kind of vanity that kills, and that the people who had counted with him had not needed his crown to do it. He said their names until he ran out of breath. He breathed. He said them again. Sansa found him there because she had made a map of his habits. "They will come for you next," she said, "because men who talk about crowns do not stop talking because the longest night has ended. Some will say you should be king of Ash. Some will say you should cut the roots of the weirwood and declare something new. Some will say you should marry a tragedy and call it peace. Don't. I am not made of crowns," he said tiredly. "None of us are," she replied. "We are made of lists and forges. We are made of knots and habits. We are made of bread and collars. If you forget that, I'll skin you alive." He laughed, a sound like a man who had found his body again. Lyanna said she'd do that first. "She would," Sansa said, and the ghost of the girl's fierce smile came between them like a draft that didn't chill. What the North kept after the dead were gone was not a pile of bodies or a new song. Songs were sung naturally. Men make songs out of objects that save them. But the thing that lasted was the forges. They stayed in every holdfast because fire is an honest luxury in the cold, and because people had learned that a place where glass is made into knives is a place where you can walk in and be told you are needed. The sheds turned to houses. The houses kept their anvils. The old men came and talked and taught and lied the way old men do and sometimes told the exact truth. The children learned that an edge is a thing you respect because you made it. The women learned that their hands had always been good for more than they had been allowed, and they did not unlearn it. There were bad days the way there always are. There were arguments about whose iron went where and who owed whom for leather that had arrived late and for pitch that had been watered. There were men who took the wrong work on purpose and had to be set to rights. There were women who were better at it than any man but had to tire of proving it again and again and then again. There were men who came with gold in their eyes to ask for secrets and were told, to their faces, that there were none, because the secret was patience and the secret was antler and the secret was a glue made from hooves and resin and boiled bone. And if they wanted that, they could sit down and learn, and they did not want that. There were visitors. Some were messengers with true words. Some were men who wore their swords like explanations. A man from the south came with a clean cloak and a tidy beard and a ring he kept turning on his finger, and he asked Jon, "Are you the king?" Jon said, "No." The man looked disappointed and then thwarted and then frightened and then angry and then turned his horse and rode away. He stopped at 3 forges on his way south and saw no king in any of them and seemed confused by this. Jon sat in the yard and learned to make collars. The first dozen he made cracked. The second dozen seated wrong. By the third dozen he could get 1 perfect collar in 9, then 1 in 5. He felt useful for an hour a day and sometimes 2 and sometimes none. He slept better with iron dust in his hair than with clean hair. Ghost would come and put his head on Jon's knee while he worked, and if anyone else had done that, Jon would have told them to stop because of the filings. He did not tell Ghost to stop. Gendry corrected him once, then twice, and then stopped correcting him, and Jon realized that the absence of correction meant he had learned something and smiled at the draft of that ease. When the spring came, as it always does, late and grudging, the forges did not close. They grew different. The dragonglass went into barrels lined with wool and oilcloth and was put down below where the earth stayed cool. The antlers were set aside on racks and collected more slowly. The leather turned into harness and bootstraps and scabbards again. Children made lures for fish in the river with little slivers of glass hidden in them, and Sansa forbade it and then relented because sometimes innovation is simply improper at a bad hour. A woman cut her hand on an old blade and did not die of it because Wolken had learned a new way of washing with ash, and that, too, they kept from this time. A habit of cleanliness, as if the cold might be kept at bay by stubbornness. Alice Karstark sent a letter with a pressed yellow flower in it and a note at the bottom. "This is my wedding day. Please tell Arya she owes me a dance." Arya read the note and did not smile on her mouth, but her eyes did something less dangerous than tears and more honest than pride. She wrote back with a little drawing of 2 boots, left and right, and a line that said, "I'll come when your baby is born. I want tea. Oh, laugh at your face." Alice wrote back, Come before then, or I'll make you laugh with a knife." Lyanna Mormont did not marry anyone. She grew into a woman the way a bear grows into the bear its cub's face promised. She kept her forge. The island kept its fish. There were men who came to ask her for a daughter, and there were men who came to ask her for a piece of the forge, and there were men who came to ask her for nothing and stayed because the island had a way of loving stubbornness. She wrote to Sansa with a hand that was quick and unpretty. "My people keep asking, what do we do now? I keep saying, do what you can do with your hands. That is the beginning of every answer that matters." Sansa wrote back, "You are a terror. I like you." Daenerys left with her dragons and with some men and with some regrets and with few apologies. She took some glass and some iron and some leather. She left behind the habit of making that she had stepped into like an old coat and found that it fit. She did not leave behind her pride, because pride is too heavy a thing to hand to someone else. She sent a letter later that said, "I am trying to be a queen that gives more than she claims. Feels like the wrong shape sometimes. But I remember how a forge sounds, and I try to find that sound in other things." Jon read the letter twice and then set it aside. He did not send hers to be shelved and read again by anyone who wanted, not because he thought it a secret, but because he thought it a voice, and it felt wrong to make it public. He sent back one line, a courtesy and a truth. "Listen to the people who file your collars." When men came to argue about crowns, they found Winterfell busy. They found stables full and yards full and forges ringing. And they found a man with black in his hair turning to white and his face still too young for the old inside it, and they offered him a chair he did not want and a name he could not bear. He took them to the forge and set a collar in front of them. "Make that fit," he said. Some did. Many did not. Some left. Some stayed and learned to listen to the glass. What was left of the Night King was nowhere to be found. Not in the roots of the trees or in the cold air at dawn. What was left of the dead was found in the corners of yards and at the edges of ponds, bones and bits and the perfect, awful handful of a child's doll, unburned, and someone would always pick that up and hold it and carry it to where things that must not become reminders are put. Ghost hunted in the woods and forgot, for a week at a time, that he had ever stood staring at something that stared back without eyes. He came home and lay on the warm stones near the forge and liked the way his belly felt against them. He took meat from the hands of children who had learned to be careful. He did not thank them because wolves do not thank, but he looked at them in a way that made some of them think gratitude might be a thing the world owes you just for sticking in it. When the summer finally came like someone late and guilty to a feast, the glass slept. It became a story told beside bread ovens and in yards where men plan how to thatch before the first frost. It became a thing in barrels, in cool cellars, in a shelf that someone dusted and someone else ignored. It became, quietly, respectfully, part of the architecture of memory. The forges did not sleep. They made horseshoes and hinges and hooks. They made nails and knives and the little iron hearts that hold drying herbs in a kitchen. They made locks and keys. They made small iron men that children stood on mantles and argued about. Sometimes, on a day when children had permission to be bored, they would take out a sliver of glass and hold it up to the sun and see that it took the light in a way iron does not, that it made darkness in the brightness, that it made brightness sharp. Jon slept badly and better by turns. He woke 4 nights out of 7 with the breath in him stalled like a bad engine. And he lay with his eyes open and counted his ribs and told them what they were called until the body listened and released him. He went to the forge in those hours and did not light it because night has a right to be night, but he touched the tools and made sure they were where they belonged, and sometimes he picked up a collar and turned it in his hand, and sometimes the turning soothed him. He thought of leaving often. He thought of staying more. He thought of being king when the men with rings on their fingers came north and argued, and he thought of killing himself on purpose with the weight of that word, and he chose, again and again, to make a collar. Sansa grew old in the face the way winter widows do when winter turns out to be a season and not a fate. She did not marry for love, though she did not marry for hate. She married for a word no one teaches girls early enough: partnership. She never forgave the world for that lesson, and she never forgot to take her joy where it was offered. She built a school beside a forge and pretended that had not been done before, and it had in a dozen small places, and she knitted them together with letters and with visits and with promises kept long after the people who had made them were dead. She put a bell over the school and told a boy from the rills to ring it whenever a thing was understood that had previously been a confusion. He overused it. She did not stop him. Arya left because of course she did, and then returned because of course she would, and stayed exactly long enough to teach 5 girls how to make a spear, and then left again before they could turn her into a story with softer edges. Gendry stayed enough and left enough and made things always. And if you walked past his open door at dawn or deep night, you would hear humming in a voice that made the glass feel as if the man holding it liked it. The two of them did not wed, not in any way priests approve of or markets gossip kindly about, and the two of them were wed in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else, and most people stopped asking because most people finally learned that other people's arrangements do not require their blessing to function. When Bran was chosen by men who had found that the world prefers accidents with excellent memories, Jon was not among the 12 or the 20 or the 100 who decided it, but he went to the yard and put a collar on a table and sat down and, after a long while, let himself feel strange relief. Bran's first letter as king had one word in it for Jon. Stay. Jon wrote back, I always intended to, and then thought better of it, and then thought worse, and then bought new boots. Bran wrote, stay anyway. The words made the space behind Jon's eyes feel hot, and he went to the Godswood and told the heart tree that he was staying, and the leaves made their old quiet, and it was enough. Years later, when children asked why there were little shrines of black glass in barns and under stairs and in corners of halls and beside ovens, their elders told stories. Some were true, some were almost, all were useful. The best of the tellers, men and women with hands scarred by heat and cuts, with shoulders bowed from work and eyes sly with memory, would end with the same sentence, sometimes said and sometimes left unspoken. We made the thing we needed at the time we needed it, and because we did it in every place, no place was alone. Then they would stand, slowly, the way old men and women stand who have been sitting too long, and they would walk to the forge to see if anyone needed a hand. And in